Hello, students. I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on Chapter 7, which covers problem formulation. In this video lecture, we will discuss the following topics: identifying a research topic or problem and posing an initial research question, sources of research topics or problems in social work practice, components of good versus bad research questions, sharpening research questions, the role of literature reviews in sharpening research questions, considering the purpose of the study, and finally, at the end of this video lecture, we will discuss two additional considerations in problem formulation, which include the time dimension and units of analysis. So in terms of learning objectives, at the end of this module, you are expected to be able to understand and explain the following: the process of identifying a research problem or topic and posing an initial research question, sources of research problems or topics in social work practice, the components of good and bad research questions, the difference between research topics and research questions, the factors that influence sharpening research questions, the role of literature reviews in influencing the problem formulation process, the 5 purposes of research, the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, the meaning of units of analysis and the 5 most common units of analysis, and finally, errors in specifying units of analysis. So we are now in unit number 3, which covers problem formulation and measurement. So as I mentioned previously, in this video lecture, we will cover Chapter 7, which discusses problem formulation. From there, we will move on to Chapter 8, which covers conceptualization in quantitative and qualitative inquiry. We will conclude this unit by discussing Chapter 9, which covers measurement. So let's begin by discussing the process of identifying a research topic or problem and posing a research question. So we are at the first step in the phases of the social work research process. So in terms of selecting research topics or problems, in social work research, selecting a topic should come from issues that confront social service agencies or information needed to solve practical problems. The researcher's personal interests come into play, but a study is more likely to have value if the topic addresses information needed to guide policy, planning, or practice decisions. The value of social work research depends more on its applicability to practice than on theory testing. So in other words, within the profession of social work, we are primarily concerned with producing the kind of research that will supply us with the information that we need to solve practice problems. So we talk a lot about this notion within the social work profession of research-informed practice and practice-informed research. And what we mean by this is that the research that we conduct as social workers should inform our practice. And in turn, what we are doing within the field in our practice should also inform the research that we conduct. So at the end of the day, really, whether the research that you conduct in an agency setting is published or not, the work that you do in an agency setting may never see the light of day. But it's really not about publishing our work. It's great if we can do that. But for us as social work practitioners, it's really about conducting research for the purposes of producing information that is going to be of value to us in our practice. And so I always say to students that research can be as difficult or as simple as you make it. It doesn't have to be this big, huge project. It can be something very simple that can guide us in our practice. So it's really about focusing on the need for information and how gathering that information is going to help us to solve a problem that we face in practice. And so this takes us back to this discussion about the difference between basic and applied research. And so we've already talked about the fact that we have our disciplines such as sociology, psychology, anthropology, and the like, and how disciplines are more focused on knowledge or developing information that is intended to build knowledge or advance knowledge for its own sake. So in this kind of research, there's not necessarily a direct or immediate practice implication that comes from or flows from this kind of research. On the other hand, within applied professions, and some of the applied professions are social work or nursing or medicine or education, these are professions which are different than disciplines. And the one way in which applied professions differ from disciplines is that our research is done for the sake of solving problems that we face in practice. And so by asking the kinds of questions that are relevant to practice, from asking those questions, we are able to gather information that is intended to have a direct or immediate application to practice. And so that is how basic research differs from applied research, and in turn, how disciplines differ from professions, or one of the ways in which they differ. There are many ways in which disciplines and professions differ, but this is one way that they differ specifically. So in terms of sources of research topics or problems in social work practice, for social workers, problems that occur in practice often serve as the gap in knowledge and therefore the source of a research topic. So oftentimes the problems that we face in practice become the source of our topics or problems that we tackle in the research process. So as an example, a social worker working at a homeless shelter noticed that there is a gap in service for individuals with co-occurring disorders. So in response to this problem, this social worker might conduct a qualitative study wherein they engage in focus groups and/or interviews that seek to uncover the needs of homeless individuals with co-occurring disorders. So this is the kind of study that a social worker would embark upon within an agency context for the purposes of producing information or gathering information that is needed in order to respond to this practice-related problem. So now let's talk about the difference between research topics and research questions. So the main thing to keep in mind here is that research topics tend to be very broad. And at some point, if we ever hope to get answers to whatever the problem is that we're facing in practice, we have to narrow our topics down into research questions. The research question is always our anchor. And if we think back to the differences, or rather the similarities between the evidence-based practice process and the social work research process, we know that one major similarity is that both processes begin with the question. And just like as you may have observed in your article critique presentations, both presentations begin with the question. So you have a specific question that your group is focused on. And so that's really the idea here, is that all research processes begin with the question. And so we have to take these broad topics or ideas that we have, and we have to become very specific and narrow them down into research questions so that we can begin to seek the answers that we are looking for. So specifically, research problems are broad starting points, as I just mentioned, that need to be narrowed down into a research question. Research problems can contain a vast number of diverse alternative research questions. So research topics, within these broader research topics, there are a number of questions that we can ask about any given topic, but it is up to us as the researcher to figure out within these broad topics, what is the question that will be the focus of my investigation? Until you narrow your problem into a specific research question, you can become immobilized without a clear place to begin your inquiry. So again, if we don't have a specific question, it can really halt us in the process. So we really need to come to this point of narrowing our topics into specific questions so that we can move forward in the research process. In terms of attributes of good research questions, good questions must be narrow, specific, and worded as a question. Good questions must also be posed in a way that can be answered by observable evidence. The answer to the question should have significant potential relevance for guiding social welfare policy or social work practice. In addition, good research questions should have more than one possible acceptable answer. So we shouldn't be asking questions that can be answered by a simple yes or no. Good questions should also be feasible given agency constraints. And so if we think back to our discussion on evidence-based practice, we talked about the idea that even in implementing the evidence-based practice process, we are still operating within a larger organizational or environmental context. And the same is true for when we're conducting research in an agency context. We always have to think about what the constraints are, and we have to become aware of any barriers and constraints that, whether we are aware of them or not, are in operation within the agency context that we function within. So it's very important that we not only seek to engage in research, but we understand the context in which we are engaging in research and what is going to be feasible or not feasible. So now let's take a look at some quote unquote good research questions. So we're going to start with the red box in the top left-hand corner. And so in this box, the question reads, what effect does client-therapist relationship have on attitudes toward therapy among minority clients? So all questions have what I like to call an anatomy. All research questions have this underlying anatomy, whether we realize it or not. Oftentimes it's not very apparent when we are reading research studies. It's not very clear what the underlying anatomy of that research question is. But there is indeed an underlying anatomy that I always like to point out to students. And what this anatomy is that typically in a well-written research question, the independent variable will always come first in the question. And this signifies something, even though oftentimes when we are reading research studies, it's not necessarily explicit that the researcher is intentionally putting the independent variable first in the question, but within the research community, there is a language. Remember on the first day of class, I said learning about research is like learning a new language. There is indeed a language, and there is indeed a way in which we communicate certain things to one another that signifies something, okay? And so client-therapist relationship is the independent variable in this question, and it is put there first intentionally. Okay, and then attitudes toward therapy is the dependent variable. And then our population is minority clients. And so essentially what we're saying here is that we want to understand the effect that this independent variable of client-therapist relationship is having on this dependent variable, which is attitudes toward therapy. Okay, so there's a specific order in which we are stating these variables for a reason. Okay, now the next question in the green box. This is an evaluation question, okay, because we're looking at the effectiveness of a specific intervention on a specific outcome, okay? So in this case, we are looking at cognitive behavioral therapy. This is our independent variable in this question. And we're looking at what effect cognitive behavioral therapy has on self-esteem, which is our dependent variable or our outcome variable. And our population here is African-American women ages 18 to 25. So this question is evaluative in nature. Now in the purple box, the question reads, what effect does teacher-student relationship, which is our independent variable, have on student engagement, which is our dependent variable, among middle school minority students at Midway Middle School? So this question is explanatory in nature because we're interested in understanding what effect a particular independent variable has on a particular dependent variable. Okay, so in other words, we're looking at the extent to which teacher-student relationship might predict student engagement. Okay, so this is explanatory in nature. Now on the bottom here, our question in the blue box says, what is the extent and nature of food insecurity among adolescents ages 13 to 19 in Waco? So I really want you to note here that this is a descriptive question. Okay, so there is no independent or dependent variable in this question. When questions are descriptive in nature, what we're trying to do is understand a specific phenomena. We're not interested in looking at the relationship between an independent and dependent variable. We are just trying to describe a phenomena. So in this case, the phenomena that we're trying to describe is food insecurity, specifically among adolescents ages 13 to 18. Now, the question in the orange box reads, what are the SNAP program participation rates among low-income minority adolescents ages 13 to 18 in Waco? So here again, this is a descriptive question. There's no independent or dependent variable. We're just trying to describe a particular phenomena. In this case, the phenomena that we're trying to describe is SNAP program participation rates, specifically among low-income minority adolescents ages 13 to 18 in Waco. So I just want to take a quick moment to also point out some of the buzzwords or the language that can help us to discern the kind of study that we are reviewing. Okay, so, and again, as I mentioned, there is a language within the research community, and I just want you to be aware of what some of that language is. So typically within studies that are seeking to describe a phenomena, some of the buzzwords or some of the language that you might see are words like scope or prevalence or rates or extent or nature. These are some of the buzzwords for, okay, this is a descriptive study. Okay, and then if it's an explanatory study or a study that is seeking to predict a particular outcome based on a certain set of factors, some of that language might be words like predictors, determinants, correlates, antecedents. These are some of the words that we might see when we look at the abstract of a study or when we look at the actual study itself. These are some of the words that might jump out at us that might signify or tell us, oh, this is an explanatory study. And then finally, when we're looking at more evaluative studies, we might see words like effectiveness or efficacy. These are words that tell us that a particular study is looking to test the effectiveness of a particular intervention on a particular outcome or set of outcomes. Okay, so this just gives you some ideas, some ways in which to discern the purpose of the study. And so we'll talk momentarily about various different purposes for research studies. And so we'll get more into this momentarily, but I just wanted to pause here and give you that little bit of information. So here are some examples of quote unquote bad research questions. So the first one reads, does social media affect family relationships? The second one reads, what effect does parental involvement have on student achievement? And the third reads, does child abuse affect mental health outcomes? So as you look at these questions, I would like you to consider the following. Does the question have potential relevance for guiding social work policy or practice? Is the question narrow, specific, and worded as a question? Is it posed in a way that can be answered by observable evidence? Does the question have more than one possible answer? And finally, would the question be feasible to answer within a social work practice context? So these are some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves as we think about how to pose a good research question, and also as we evaluate the research questions posed by others in research studies. So here are the answers. So for the first question, the question can be answered with a yes or no response. In addition, the term social media is too vague. So what type of social media are we referring to specifically? And also, which family relationships are we referring to, and among what population? For the second question, This question also has multiple answers, but it's still too vague. So are we talking about mother involvement or father involvement? Also, which achievement outcome are we referring to? Are we talking about grades, attendance, student engagement, and among what population? And then finally, the third question, this question can be answered with a yes or no response. Also, we need to think about what type of child abuse are we referring to, because there are many different types of maltreatment. Also, which mental health outcome are we referring to? There are so many mental health outcomes that we can explore here, okay? And then among what population? So I have rewritten each of these questions to make them a bit more clear, okay? So the first one now reads, what effect does Facebook usage? So we have become more specific about the type of social media use. We're specifically talking about Facebook usage. Okay, so what effect does Facebook use have on sibling relationships? So we've also become clear about which family relationship we are referring to. And among African-American families, so this is our population. The second question now reads, what effect does father involvement have on academic success as defined by class grades and school engagement among African-American families? And then finally, the third question, what effect does physical abuse? So we are being specific about the type of abuse we are seeking to understand. So the specific type of abuse here is physical abuse. So what effect does physical abuse have on child mental health outcomes as measured by depression and anxiety? So we're not just saying any mental health outcome, right? So now we're being specific and we're saying we are interested in understanding these specific mental health outcomes, depression and anxiety, and among African-American families specifically, because we could be talking about any population, right? So we really need to be specific about the population that we're studying, because these things can play out differently depending on our sample or our population. So it's very important to be specific. Now let's talk about problem formulation as it relates to, or the part of problem formulation that is related to sharpening the research questions. So this is a part of the problem formulation process. And we talked about this when we talked about this briefly when we covered chapter 3, where we talked about how a part of formulating a problem involves this process of sharpening the question. So although we may start out with an initial research question that's kind of broad, there are some ways in which we can begin to sharpen our question to make it that much more specific, okay? And so here we are in the second phase of the social work research process. And so here we are going to talk about, again, some of the factors that are at play in this process of sharpening our research question. And then we will move on to the second part of problem formulation, which is related to defining the purpose for our study. So here's some of the factors at play that can come into play rather in this process of sharpening our research question. This sharpening process can be influenced by theory. It can be influenced by ideologies and paradigms, logic, whether we are approaching our research study from a deductive or inductive standpoint. Sharpening our question can also be influenced by social work practice models that we might find in the literature. It can also be sharpened by feasibility. Remember, I mentioned just a moment ago the importance of considering feasibility and applicability to practice. So as we examine our question, we can think about, is this question feasible given my agency context? Is it applicable to my practice? So these are some of the questions we can begin to ask ourselves that can help us to sharpen our question. And so as a result of this, we possibly may end up needing to tweak our question some, because perhaps the initial question we ask isn't feasible for our agency context, or perhaps it's not as applicable to our practice as it needs to be. And so this is a reason to rethink a question and reshape it. Okay, also current literature. So we're going to talk in a moment about the role of literature reviews in helping us to sharpen our research question as well. So again, we may start with an initial broad question. But as we continue to refine that question, these are some of the things that can help us to do that. And so I mentioned this a couple of videos ago, and how one of the studies that I've conducted in the past was largely shaped by theory. Okay, so there was a particular theory that I found within the literature called Belsky's process model of the determinants of parenting. And so this is the original model. And essentially what the model suggests is that the outcome of parenting, or the way in which one parents, is shaped by the characteristics of the parent, the characteristics of the child, and also larger contextual influences. And the way in which this particular theory talks about contextual influences is mainly in the form of social support. So any social support that a parent might have within the larger context within which they parent can also influence one's parenting. And so after learning about this particular theoretical framework, this really influenced the way in which I thought about my problem and how I carried out my study, and the types of research questions that I asked in my study. And so as a result of this model, or learning about this model, I developed my own theoretical framework. And this is what it looked like. So I tweaked the model slightly, because remember on the last slide, I just showed you that it looked at the outcome of parenting. But in my study, I was interested in specifically looking at the outcome of father involvement. So I did make that modification to the model. And then also the original theoretical model looked at the parents' characteristics in general. So in the original model, there was not a lot of focus on or a lot of distinction between the parenting of mothers versus the parenting of fathers. And so I really wanted to shape my theoretical model in such a way that it honed specifically in on the father's characteristics and not just the parents' characteristics in general, because the first question that comes to mind when I see parent is which parent, right? And so I knew in my study that I wanted to be more specific. And so here you see that I have two father characteristics that I examined. I have two characteristics of the child that I examined, and I have two aspects of contextual sources of stress and support. So this is just one example of how theory and different theoretical models within the literature can influence the research process, specifically as it relates to formulating research questions, and then in turn, how we design our studies, how we interpret the findings from our studies. So theory can play a huge role in helping us to sharpen our question. And so as you can see here, in the final research question that I posed, you see elements of the theoretical model played out in the question. So you see the question says, what set of father characteristics, child characteristics, and contextual sources of stress and support best predict father involvement among African-American non-resident fathers? So you see that the question that I'm asking is in terms of the theoretical framework that I'm employing, right? So we take the theoretical framework and we take the elements from the framework and we infuse those elements into our question, and that influences the questions that we ask. Okay, so this is just one example of how theory can influence the research process. And so another big part of the research process, or another big factor that influences the research process, is also literature reviews. So I just want to give a quick note on the role of literature reviews in sharpening research questions. So novice researchers commonly make the mistake of putting off their literature reviews until they have sharpened their research question and have come up with a design to investigate it. Research can be done this way, but it is not the most efficient use of time and resources. It is best to undertake a thorough literature review as early in the research process as possible. Until the literature is reviewed, there is no way of knowing the value of the study and where it fits into the larger conversation on the topic. It is important as researchers that we make decisions about our research studies, not in ignorance to, but in light of prior research. Okay, so although it may seem like a small thing, literature reviews are very, very important in the research process in terms of helping us to sharpen our questions, because we might start out with one question, but then we might read the literature and say, well, someone's already investigated that question already. Or I didn't consider this factor. I need to include this factor in my question as well, because it's very important for the population that I'm studying. So we can't be blind to what the literature is saying. Ultimately, in our studies, we want to make a contribution to the literature. And it's hard to know how to make a contribution if you really don't know what's already been done, right? And so I always tell students that looking at the literature, it's almost like having an ear and eye to a larger conversation related to your topic. Because you might find that one researcher found this and another researcher found that, and the next researcher found this, right? And so as you are reading study after study after study, you're able to kind of see the patterns across the literature, and you're able to make an argument, a more informed argument about how your study fits into that picture and why it matters, okay? And so this is a very, very important step in the process of sharpening our question, because we want to make sure that the questions that we are asking are relevant, not only to practice, but to the research community as well. So literature reviews help us to answer some of the following questions about what is known, problematic, or missing. Specifically, it helps us to answer what is already known about our topic. What are the gaps in knowledge about our topic? What research has been done that is similar to what I am thinking about conducting? Have other researchers defined and measured key concepts in my research question? What data sources have other researchers used? Who are the existing experts on the topic? Are there research questions about the topic that need further research? What methods have been used to study the topic? What theories have been used to explain the topic? And so the literature review process for me in conducting a lot of my research has been so helpful to me. Specifically in the study that I've been sharing with you over the course of this semester, one of the things that I found in the literature is that the vast majority of the studies that were being done at the time when I conducted my study, the vast majority of them were quantitative in nature. Most of them utilize quantitative methods. And so that was a big determining factor for me in the decision to conduct a mixed methods study, because I saw that there was a gap in the literature as it relates to mixed methods, okay? And so because of that, that definitely shaped how I formulated my questions, because when I formulated the questions for my study, I had a quantitative question and I had a qualitative question. Okay, because my study was mixed methods. So just looking at what others had done really helped me to shape my study. In addition, as I just shared with you, as I reviewed the literature, I was not only looking to see what others had found, but also what theories they had used. So that helped me as I reviewed the literature. I was able simultaneously to track down theories that had been used by others, right? Because when we sort of justify the theory that we're using in our study, it's helpful to be able to say that other studies have also employed the same theory, or perhaps other studies have employed these theories, but they haven't considered this one, right? And so you can only say that if you use the literature, or if you've reviewed the literature rather. Also, literature reviews help us to track down measurement tools. Is to see what measures others have used to capture certain variables in their studies, okay? So literature reviews can serve a variety of purposes, but again, it's very, very important that we engage in this process prior to formulating our research questions and as early in the process as possible. And so here is just a list of questions that literature reviews help us to answer. And I won't go through all of these, but I thought it was very helpful to see this list and to help us to think about this idea of how literature reviews can help us to sharpen our research questions. I pulled this from another study that I had reviewed in preparation for this lecture. And so when you get an opportunity, you can go back and take a look at some of these questions that help to further solidify this point of the importance of literature reviews. And here's one other additional table as well. Now let's talk about the part of problem formulation that is related to considering the purpose of the study. So we're still talking about problem formulation, okay? And so we now know that a big part of problem formulation or the problem formulation process is sharpening the question. And so as it relates to sharpening the question, we know some of the devices or some of the things that can help us to sharpen our question. So now once we sharpened our question, now we can become clear about what the exact purpose for our study is. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. So your text talks about 5 key purposes for research. Okay, and so those 5 purposes are exploratory, explanatory, descriptive, evaluative, and measurement construction. So in terms of exploratory research, exploratory research is a preliminary investigation of a relatively unknown field, which aims to gain new insights on a topic. So typically, there are no hypotheses specified in exploratory research because we're typically investigating something that is unknown. And so if there's no precedent for the topic that we're investigating, if there's no precedent in the literature for that topic, it's difficult to form hypotheses because we typically form hypotheses based on information that we've gathered from existing literature. The existing literature helps us to formulate our hypotheses. But when we're investigating something new, then no hypotheses are specified, okay? And so exploratory research can be both quantitative and qualitative in nature, okay? Typically, exploratory research is qualitative, but there are times in which quantitative research is also exploratory in nature. The most important idea here to keep in mind is that when it comes to exploratory research, it's about investigating a topic that is relatively unknown. No matter what our methods are, whether our methods are quantitative or qualitative, it's about investigating an understudied area. In terms of explanatory research is done to explain the why behind a phenomenon and to predict future occurrences. Okay, so typically in explanatory research, when we get to the point where we are ready to conduct research on this level for this purpose, there's typically a precedent in the literature already for the topic that we're studying. And so usually within explanatory research, research hypotheses are formulated. Okay, so explanatory research is characterized by research hypotheses that specify the nature and direction of the relationship between variables being studied. So once we're able to review the literature and we're able to get a sense of how others have theorized or hypothesized about our topic, that gives us some information about how things might go in our study, okay? And so that provides the basis upon which we are able to formulate our own hypotheses because we have some precedent, we have something to go on, we have the work of others that helps us to understand how we need to be thinking about our research questions and how we need to be hypothesizing. So typically, again, our hypotheses are drawn from previous literature if there is a precedent in the literature on our topic. Okay, so this is what explanatory research is all about. So descriptive research. Descriptive research is used to describe the characteristics of the population or phenomena that is being studied. This methodology focuses more on the what of the research subject, rather than the why. Okay, so again, descriptive research is not about examining the relationships between variables. So in descriptive research, we're not seeking to do that. We're just trying to describe, right? So if you think back to the descriptive questions that I shared with you earlier, you saw in those questions, when we sort of broke down the anatomy of those questions, you saw where there was no independent or dependent variable. We were just seeking to describe a particular phenomenon, for example, food insecurity or participation in a SNAP program. So we're just trying to get to the bottom of the what, okay? We're not trying to answer this question of why food insecurity occurs or why participation in SNAP programs might be low, right? So we're not trying to answer the why behind the phenomena. We're just trying to describe, okay? So that is descriptive research. Program evaluation research involves collecting and analyzing information about a program's activities, characteristics, and outcomes in order to systematically assess its worth of time, money, effort, and resources spent to achieve goals. So program evaluation research is really about trying to understand a program and the extent to which that program is achieving its expected outcomes and the extent to which the program is actually working, right? So the thought is that if the program is working and if there's data to suggest that the program is effective, that it is in turn worth the time, money, effort, and resources that are being invested into it. So we have a whole sort of body of research that just focuses on program evaluation. And we have a whole chapter where we talk about program evaluation. So we'll get more into that topic later on in the semester. But the idea to keep in mind here is that when research is evaluative in nature, we are typically studying programs and the effectiveness of those programs for the purposes of being able to evaluate their merit or their worth. And just a quick note on descriptive research. So descriptive studies can be both quantitative and qualitative in nature. So descriptive quantitative studies focus on counting things or describing the characteristics of a population. For example, what is the scope and prevalence of depression among teens in Waco? So if we're just looking to describe the scope or prevalence, and remember I kind of gave you some language or buzzwords early on that help us to determine whether a study is descriptive in nature. So if we're asking a question like, what is the scope and prevalence of depression among teens in Waco? This is a descriptive quantitative question, because from this kind of question is going to come numbers, right? And so when we're producing numbers, then that means that our study is quantitative in nature. So we're still not looking at the relationship between variables or the impact of a given independent variable on a dependent, but this kind of study still produces quantitative data because we're talking about the scope and prevalence of a particular phenomena, okay? Now, descriptive qualitative studies focus on providing thick, rich descriptions of phenomena, including environments, interactions, meanings, and everyday lives. So for example, with the descriptive study that is qualitative in nature, we might ask a question like, what is it like to walk in the shoes of a Waco teen with depression? So from this kind of question is going to flow more text data, right? So data that is more in the form of words and descriptions of what this experience is like. Okay, so both kinds of studies are descriptive in nature, but it all depends on how we ask the question. How we ask the question is going to determine the kind of data that we get in return, whether that data is quantitative in nature or qualitative in nature. And finally, measurement construction. So some studies aim to develop and or test measurement instruments that can be used by other researchers or practitioners as part of the assessment or evaluation aspects of their practices. So measurement construction studies, again, are all about designing or rather developing and testing measurement tools. Okay, and so qualitative methods can be used to help refine items in a measurement tool. So we can do interviews or focus groups that can help us to better understand the clarity of our items in a given measurement tool and how those items need to be tweaked or adjusted in order to make reading or comprehension of that tool easier. In addition, quantitative methods can be used to assess whether the instrument as a whole is reliable and valid. So we can use quantitative methods in order to assess the reliability and validity of a measurement tool. But generally speaking, what I want you to understand here is that Yet another purpose for research is measurement construction, okay? And these are the studies that we would look to in our practice if we're wanting to locate measurement tools that we can use, okay? There are tons of studies out there that are just focused on the development and construction of measurement. And so when we're thinking about assessment tools, we would want to look for studies in the literature that are just focused on measurement. And so here's an example of a study that I pulled in my work in the past and utilized as a measurement tool for measurement purposes in a study that I've conducted previously. And so this is a measure on parenting satisfaction and efficacy. And we'll talk later about this specific tool. We'll delve more into this tool when we talk about chapter 9, which covers measurement. And so I want to wrap up this discussion about purposes for research by also stating that there can be multiple purposes of research, okay? So the purposes for research are not necessarily mutually exclusive. There are many different purposes of research, and sometimes in a single study, the focus can just be descriptive, or sometimes the focus can just be exploratory or just be explanatory. And then sometimes there are studies that have multiple purposes, and they pursue those purposes simultaneously within the same study. So for example, what I often see is studies that are both descriptive and explanatory in nature. In fact, I'm working on a study like that right now that I've shared with you previously, where we're looking at the attitudes of social work practitioners toward the EBP process. And so this particular study is both descriptive and explanatory. Okay, so our purpose is we have simultaneous purposes here, or multiple purposes that we are seeking to employ in this one study. And so here's some examples in the literature. And so here we see, and I circled prevalence rates in red because again, I'm trying to sensitize you to the language in the literature. And so immediately when I see this title, this jumps out at me: prevalence rates of male and female sexual violence perpetrators in a national sample of adolescents. So immediately when I see this word prevalence rates, that tells me this is at least in part a descriptive study, okay? But as we read the objective of the study and the results here highlighted in yellow, we see that the sole purpose actually of this study is descriptive in nature. And then we see this study here, which we can't necessarily tell from the title, but if we look here at the purpose of the study, this gives us a little bit more information. So we see here that the purpose of the study, or the authors write that the article describes the rates and correlates of sexual risk behaviors among adolescents screened in an urban emergency department. Okay, so again, going back to what I mentioned earlier and picking up on the language, right? So we have to get to a point where we can decode this fancy language that researchers are utilizing, right? So essentially what they're saying to us, without really explicitly saying it, is that they have two purposes in their study. And so the word rates tells us that they are seeking to describe, right, something. They're seeking to describe the phenomena that is the focus in this study. The word correlates tells us that they are also seeking to explain the phenomena, okay? So remember I said earlier that the word correlates is another word for predictors, okay? And so anytime we're talking about correlates or predictors, typically we are engaging in explanatory research. So I just wanted to point this out to you so that you can get sort of a good understanding and begin to start to decode some of this language that you're seeing out there in the literature. So we are going to wrap up our discussion by just talking very briefly about two additional considerations in problem formulation. And they are the time dimension of the study and the unit of analysis. So within research studies, particularly those studies that are quantitative in nature, we have either cross-sectional or longitudinal research studies. So cross-sectional research studies focus on a cross-section of the population at one point in time, okay? So typically this is kind of a get in, get out kind of thing where we go in to collect our data, which typically is a survey of some sort, and we collect that data at one point in time, and that's it. It's just one time point, okay? And this is in comparison to longitudinal research, which involves gathering data over an extended period of time. So there may be several data points that we collect. And oftentimes what you'll see are the language. So again, I'm giving you the language here. The language that you'll often see in longitudinal studies to describe these time points is waves. Okay, so researchers will refer to wave 1, wave 2, wave 3, wave 4. So in other words, what they're saying, and the number of waves is different depending on the study. It all depends on how long the researchers spent collecting this data. But the idea here is that in longitudinal studies, there are several data points or time points or waves of data that are collected. And so this is the main difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal research. And so here are some of the advantages and disadvantages of each type of research. And so cross-sectional quite naturally tends to be less expensive because it's only one time, right, that we're going out to collect data. It costs money to conduct research. And so the shorter the period of time that we spend out in the field, the less expensive, okay? Cross-sectional studies are also easier to design and implement because it's only one data point that we have to be concerned about. In addition, there are minimal problems with attrition or dropout over time. So in other words, when we're only collecting data at one point in time, we don't necessarily have to worry about following people over time or tracking people over time or people dropping out. And even in some instances, people passing away or dying in the process of the study or getting sick or whatever the case may be, life happens, right? And so we know when we're dealing with human beings that there's a high likelihood of dropout over the course of time. And so when we're engaging in cross-sectional research, we don't have this worry as much as we do in longitudinal research. And then finally, the disadvantage with cross-sectional research is that it does not allow for observing cause and effect relationships. So in cross-sectional research, we are typically looking at correlational relationships only. We cannot speak to cause and effect with cross-sectional data, right? And so we'll talk more about this whole idea of causality and cause and effect when we talk about experimental designs. But cross-sectional research just doesn't allow for us to really examine causality on any level. And so on the other hand, with longitudinal research, of course, it tends to be more expensive, more difficult to design and implement. It also increases the likelihood of attrition or dropout in the study over time. And then also, but the one advantage to longitudinal research is that it does allow us to observe cause and effect relationships. Okay, so these are the main differences between the two. And then I won't go into detail on this, but I did want to make sure that you're aware that your text does touch on 3 different types of longitudinal studies, which are trend studies, panel studies, and cohort studies. And so I won't require you to know the difference between these 3. The main thing that I want you to know is the difference between cross-sectional and longitudinal research in general. And then finally, let's discuss units of analysis. Okay, so units of analysis are the specific elements that will be the focus of your analysis and the element to which you will generalize findings. There are 5 common units of analysis, which include individuals, groups, organizations, programs, and social artifacts. Often, social work research focuses on the individual. Clearly specifying the unit of analysis in research is important to avoid an illegitimate shift from one unit of analysis to another unit of analysis. Shifting from one unit of analysis to another can result in false conclusions. So here are some examples of different types of unit of analysis. So for example, at the individual level, our unit of analysis might be non-resident fathers within the West Waco Community Health Center. By comparison, if we were looking at or focused on groups as a unit of analysis, we might be more interested in cohorts or groups of fathers who have participated in the support group at West Waco Community Mental Health Center. Now I'm going to skip down to social artifacts. I'll allow you to read through this table on your own, but I'm going to skip down to social artifacts because this is something that students often find a bit more difficult to grasp. So social artifacts are things like documents, right? So when our unit of analysis is social artifacts, it typically doesn't involve people, right? It typically involves documents of some kind. And so if our unit of analysis was social artifacts, it might be something like case files, okay, of fathers who participate in the social support group that is run by the Fatherhood Program at West Waco Community Mental Health Center. So if we were interested in understanding, let's just say, participation rates or involvement in the support group, we might look at the case files to see perhaps maybe what are some things that are going on with these fathers and what are some of the things that they're seeking services for that could possibly help us to explain or understand participation rates. Okay, and so we wouldn't go to the fathers themselves in this case and ask them, we would look at their case files if we decided that social artifacts would be our unit of analysis. So when you get a chance, just go through and read through each of these examples, and hopefully this will give you a better sense of the five most common types of unit of analysis and how they differ. And so finally, let's talk about errors in specifying units of analysis, specifically the concept of ecological fallacy. So when researchers collect and analyze data based on ecological fallacy occurs, rather, when researchers collect and analyze data based on one unit of analysis, such as groups, but they draw conclusions based on another unit of analysis, which is individuals. Okay, so we can indeed have multiple units of analysis in any given study. However, if we formulate our questions and we design our studies based on individuals, then we should not be drawing conclusions based on groups. Okay, so it's important that we be consistent throughout all phases of the research process when it comes to units of analysis. Okay, so if we start out saying that our unit of analysis is individuals, then that means that we're going to formulate our questions based on individuals, we're going to design our study based on individuals, and therefore we're going to interpret our data based on individuals. So we're not going to switch units of analysis up throughout the process. We're going to stay consistent throughout the entire process to ensure that we are drawing our inferences and our conclusions in a way that is accurate and credible. So in summary, we have discussed in this video lecture several topics, which include identifying a research topic or problem and posing research questions, sources of research topics or problems in social work practice, components of good versus bad research questions, sharpening research questions, the role of literature reviews in sharpening research questions, considering the purpose of the study, and finally, 2 additional considerations in problem formulation, which included the time dimension and units of analysis. Next, we will move on to 2 additional aspects of problem formulation, which include conceptualization, which will be covered in Chapter 8, and measurement or operationalization, which will be covered in Chapter 9. Now is the point at which I invite you to check for your understanding of the concepts discussed in this video. You can do this in one of 3 ways, which is to complete the form on the left-hand side and click submit, or copy and paste the link into your browser on the right-hand side, or scan the QR code with your cell phone. I hope that this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.